Article 17 of the Constitution of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea says this: "The state shall promote unity with people all over the world who defend their independence and resolutely support and encourage the struggles of all people who oppose all forms of aggression and interference and fight for their country's independence and national and class emancipation." If you know nothing about North Korea except for Article 17 of its constitution, you could be forgiven for thinking that the DPRK might support Ukraine in its war against Russia. However, the opposite is true. North Korea has not only thoroughly supported Russia in its war, but has sent as many as 15,000 troops, according to South Korean estimates, to aid Russia in its war against Ukraine. Given the importance of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict today, it's congruently pertinent to understand the depth of the relationship between Russia and the DPRK. In this video, I'm going to go over why the DPRK is sending so many troops to fight in the Russo-Ukraine war, and that their decision reflects a long-standing deep cooperation between Russia and North Korea, as well as existing diplomatic agreements and the North Korean Constitution. First, let's start with some context. Following the Japanese capitulation in 1945, formerly Japanese-owned Korea was divided into two occupation zones by the Soviets and Americans. They were meant to be temporary before a unified Korean government could emerge, but the unification effort failed, and the Soviet Union attempted to model the nascent North Korean state on its own socialist system instead. Therefore, the new North Korean constitution was not only modeled after the Soviet constitution, but it was also hand-edited by Joseph Stalin and his political commissar to the Far Eastern Front, Terentij Shtaikov. One glaring piece of evidence supporting the theory that the 1948 constitution was initially based on the Soviet constitution was Article 31, which granted protections to ethnic minorities, despite the fact that North Korea is an incredibly culturally homogeneous nation. This phrase was possibly included just because the North Korean model, the Soviet Union, was itself a multinational state. The frivolity of this clause is a likely reason for its exclusion from the North Korean Constitution of 1972. Now, Shtaikov was a significant supporter of Kim Il-sung and his ambition to unify the Korean peninsula through military action. Shtaikov convinced the previously skeptical Joseph Stalin to approve invasion plans of South Korea and provide limited military support to North Korea. What followed this decision was a long and protracted conflict between the twin Koreas that resulted in a stalemate. Throughout the war, North Korea utilized limited Soviet support to maintain its war effort. Now, following the ceasefire that for all intents and purposes ended the Korean War in 1953, the DPRK continued to rely on Soviet aid and forge a close partnership with the Soviet Union. The aid was in fact so extensive that a halt in aid following the collapse of the Soviet Union caused North Korea to experience a significant famine due to drastically reduced trade with the nations of the former USSR, including a 90% reduction in Russian exports. The extent of Soviet aid to the DPRK is likely a major component behind the regime's continual survival during the decades after the Korean War. Now, following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the beginning of an uncertain future relationship between Russia and the DPRK, then leader Kim Jong-il began and eventually completed the creation of a nuclear weapons program, and Vladimir Putin's consolidation of power in Russia and increasing antagonism with the United States since the late 2000s saw the relationship between Russia and North Korea deepen. For the past several years, including since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the DPRK has remained a steadfast diplomatic partner of Russia, and even voted against an early effort of the United Nations to condemn Russian military action. By November 2024, American intelligence published reports stating that North Korea had sent troops to fight in the Russo-Ukrainian war.
As for the so-called military cooperation with Russia, my delegation does not feel any need for a comment on such groundless stereotype rumors aimed at smearing the image of the DPRK and undermining the legitimate friendly and cooperative relations between sovereign states.
Initially, the DPRK denied all accusations of sending soldiers to fight for Ukraine. But just 6 months later, in the April of 2025, the DPRK began to acknowledge its role in the Russian-Ukraine war, stating that it had sent troops against Russia in repelling the Ukrainian army in the Kursk region. Kursk, for context, is a Russian oblast on the border with Ukraine that Ukraine invaded and partially occupied in August of 2024. Some diplomats, such as the former U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, speculate that Ukrainian occupation of the territory is an invaluable piece of leverage against Russia in prospective peace negotiations. This potentially allows Ukraine to have a better negotiating position in regards to territory loss or security guarantees. Both Russian and North Korean sources have claimed that North Korean soldiers have only advanced inside the Kursk region and only assisted Russia in retaking that oblast. The statement is consistent with the DPRK's stated objective to repel the Ukrainian army from Kursk, and it's consistent with the Russian-North Korean Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership that mandates one party remove the prevailing threat if the other party is subject to a direct threat of armed invasion. Therefore, the DPRK is, in its own view, not violating Article 17 of its constitution by aiding Russia in the war against Ukraine. Rather, it's in perfect accord with the article. If you take the perspective that Russia is somehow either the immediate or overarching victim of Western expansionism, North Korea is now defending the independence and aiding the struggle of the Russian people in Kursk against Ukrainian aggression and interference. Now, the exact implications of the North Korean troops in Kursk are on the further course of world history are unclear at the moment. It appears that the North Korean expedition played some positive role in assisting Russian forces in retaking the vast majority of the Kursk region, such that net Ukrainian gains in Kursk since August of 2024 have been almost entirely erased. North Korean assistance in repelling the Ukrainian army from Russia proper is likely to erase any upper hand Ukraine could have gained from occupying Russian land in peace negotiations, and Ukraine is therefore more likely to get less out of any eventual peace deal, and Russia is conversely more likely to get more out of such a deal. This could have major implications on European politics, as it may preclude Ukraine from joining the European Union or NATO, as well as allow for potential future conflicts between Russia and Ukraine should there be no security guarantees. The decision of the DPRK to send troops to Kursk will likely also see a major strengthening in the relationship between the DPRK and Russia, as international sanctions and condemnation since the start of the Russo-Ukrainian war have severely isolated Russia from much of the global market system. North Korea has remained a steadfast supporter of Russia. Now, it's not entirely clear why the North Korean leadership initially attempted to deny allegations of its troops aiding Russia in repelling Ukrainian forces from Kursk. The North Korean regime is often viewed to be a very secretive regime, which does not allow its domestic or international media to learn anything that the regime itself does not want others to know. It's therefore very hard for international and especially Western media to get a good handle on the facts and information coming out of North Korea, as the DPRK views the American-led West as among its principal enemies. One potential reason for the North Korean administration initially denying American intelligence reports is a general belief that the military operation in Kursk might be more successful if Ukrainian allies were unaware or doubtful of the North Korean presence. Given the massive sanctions the DPRK currently faces, it's unlikely that any threat of additional sanctions would do anything to dissuade the DPRK from taking more action. What I think is most plausible, though, is the North Korean denial of involvement is a hedge against failure. When North Korean leadership initially sent troops to Ukraine, they didn't know if their operation would succeed or not. And therefore, it would be a bad bet to send the troops to Ukraine and tell the population about it if they might get killed and they might lose, as that would mean the regime has to admit defeat. It's better to wait until you've already won and then admit to it afterwards. However, in any case, their soldiers are being sent to Kursk. The DPRK did eventually acknowledge its military involvement in the Russo-Ukrainian war, going so far as to hold a state ceremony to commemorate and immortalize the fallen North Korean soldiers in the Russo-Ukrainian war by Kim Jong-un himself, just 6 months after they denied any involvement in the war. This decision to admit the involvement could have been the result of the overall success of the operation, as a fear of failure no longer influenced Kim's administration to deny involvement in the conflict. By holding the ceremony after general success in repelling Ukrainian forces from Kursk, the DPRK is able to frame the soldiers as heroes who victoriously beat a neo-Nazi army, rather than a needless casualty. The decision to participate in the war is also likely a reflection of the DPRK's long-standing history with Russia and its predecessor state, the Soviet Union. North Korea had a close diplomatic relationship with Russia since its foundation by Kim Il-sung, including all the support that the Soviet Union gave during and after the Korean War. One could also view the Kim administration's decision to recognize the fallen in the Russian reoffensive into Kursk as a step towards mobilizing the North Korean people for war, and instilling a mindset of the North Korean people as a people willing to sacrifice and use military force to achieve their ends. This framing is especially salient given the recent amendments made to the North Korean constitution, renouncing unification with South Korea as a goal of the regime, and recognizing South Korea as a hostile nation rather than a same-race nation. These changes are expected to be implemented to the next constitution, but they haven't been made available for foreign publication yet, given the DPRK's very secretive history of revealing constitutional changes to foreign publications. The recent amendment to the Constitution of the DPRK, renouncing reunification as a goal, now postulates the end of an era following amendments to the 1992 Constitution that saw peaceful reunification with South Korea as one of the regime's chief objectives. The nuclear-armed North Korea therefore seems to be taking a more combative approach to the South, and making any use of North Korean military force all the more threatening. Any attempt by the Kim administration to show the prowess of the North Korean military abroad, such as in Kursk, and the North Korean willingness to use force, thereby promulgates a more aggressive and militaristic vision of the DPRK, against not just Ukraine, but its overarching enemies of South Korea and the United States too. In conclusion, the Kim administration's decision to send North Korean troops to Kursk to aid Russia and the Russia-Ukraine war is a reflection of both the long-standing political relationship between the DPRK and Russia, given the Soviet Union's foundational role in determining the nature and the survival of the DPRK, and the recent shift in the North Korean attitude, exemplified by recent modifications to its constitution, to position the DPRK as a more aggressive force on the world stage in line with its prior diplomatic agreements and its constitution.